Silas kneaded the dough with a rhythm that had been carved into his bones over 30 years. His hands, calloused and dusted with white flour, moved with a precision that the master relied on, yet never acknowledged. But today, the rhythm was different. There was a weight in the center of the dough that didn't belong. It wasn't a pocket of air or a lump of unmixed flour. It was the purple spur. Silas felt the hard, curved grain beneath his palm, a tiny piece of fungus that looked like the claw of a bird. It was ergot. To an untrained eye, it was just a bit of debris in a cheap sack of rye. To Silas, who had watched his grandmother treat the sick back in the old days, it was death in a crust. He didn't pick it out. Instead, he pressed it deeper into the loaf meant for Master Sterling's private table. He knew exactly what it would do. It would rot the man's blood from the inside out. It would turn his veins into rivers of ice and his skin into a blackened, peeling mess. Master Sterling thought he was being clever, saving his failing estate by feeding toxic purple-black grain to the people in the quarters. He thought he was disposing of evidence by filling the stomachs of his property with poison. What he didn't realize was that a man who handles the bread knows every grain that goes into the oven, and Silas was done being the only one who felt the fire. The Sterling Plantation used to be the jewel of this part of Maryland. Now it was just a hollow shell held together by debt and a master who was drowning in his own pride. The air here always smelled of damp earth and wood smoke, but lately there was a sharper scent underneath the smell of something decaying while it was still alive. You could see it in the way the fences leaned and the way the paint peeled off the big house like dead skin. Master Sterling was a man who couldn't stand the thought of losing. He had spent his inheritance on bad bets and worse crops, and now the bank was knocking on his door. He was desperate, and a desperate man is the most dangerous animal in the woods. To save a few dollars, he had purchased 3 wagon loads of damaged rye from a merchant in Baltimore. The grain was grade C, marked clearly as not for human consumption. It was infested with ergot, a fungus that grows in the damp and turns the grain into a delivery system for a slow, agonizing death. Sterling knew. He had seen the black spurs in the sacks. He had read the warning on the bill of sale. But he didn't care. He figured the people in the quarters were sturdy enough to handle a little rot. Or maybe he just didn't care if they died, as long as it kept his ledger in the black for 1 more month. It started with Caleb. Caleb was 20 years old, strong as an ox, and worked the northern fields without a word of complaint. One Tuesday, he complained that his feet felt like they were standing in hot coals. By Thursday, he couldn't put his boots on. He said the holy fire was eating him. Master Sterling told the overseer to whip him for laziness, but when Miller raised the lash, he saw Caleb's toes. They were turning a bruised, sickly purple. The skin was cold to the touch, but Caleb was screaming that he was burning. Within a week, the smell of gangrene was so thick in the quarters that you could taste it in your water. Sterling didn't call a doctor. He didn't change the rations. He just told Silas to bake more bread and keep his mouth shut. He told everyone it was a curse from God, a plague brought on by their own sins. But Silas knew better. He had seen the master in the middle of the night moving sacks of grain in the barn, trying to hide the purple-black dust that coated the floorboards. Notice how a man like Sterling always looks for someone else to blame when the walls start closing in. He walked through the quarters with a handkerchief pressed to his nose, looking at the dying men and women as if they were broken tools he was disappointed to have to replace. He didn't see the mothers crying over children who couldn't feel their fingers. He didn't see the terror in the eyes of the young girls. He only saw his profit margins. He thought he was untouchable behind the walls of the big house. He thought the flour he ate was different from the flour he gave to the help. And for a while it was. Silas made sure of that. Silas kept the clean flour in the small barrel under the table, the good stuff that Sterling had reserved for himself. But the injustice was a heavy stone in Silas's gut. Every time he heard a scream from the quarters, that stone got heavier. Every time he saw his daughter, Eliza, looking at her own hands in fear, wondering if she would be the next one to feel the fire, Silas felt a cold, hard resolve settling over him. Eliza was 19, and she was a house servant. She saw things the others didn't. She was the one who cleaned the master's study, the one who saw the stacks of unpaid bills and the frantic letters to the bank, and she was the one who saw the most important piece of evidence of all. One night, while the rest of the house was asleep, Eliza had been sent to fetch a fresh candle for the overseer. She took a shortcut through the old barn, the one Sterling had ordered everyone to stay away from. Through a crack in the door, she saw him. The master was kneeling on the floor, his fine silk coat covered in dust. He was pouring grain from one sack into another. He was mixing the clean rye with the toxic moldy stuff, trying to stretch his supply so he wouldn't have to buy more for the big house. He was so focused on his work that he didn't hear the floorboard creak. He didn't see Eliza's eyes widen in the dark. She saw the bill of sale sitting on a crate nearby, a piece of paper that proved he knew exactly what he was doing. It was a receipt for grade C rye, signed in his own shaky hand. When Eliza told Silas what she had seen, the baker didn't say a word. He just kept kneading the bread, but his hands were trembling. It wasn't just that the master was killing the workers. He was now feeding that same rot to everyone, even his own family, just to save a few coins. The man's greed had finally overtaken his survival instinct. Silas knew he couldn't just go to the authorities. A slave's word meant nothing against a plantation owner, even a bankrupt one. He needed more than a story. He needed the paper, and he needed the poison to do its work. He told Eliza to stay quiet, to watch where the master hid that bill of sale, and to wait. The truth is written in the grain, and the harvest is coming. The next morning, the sickness took a turn. It wasn't just the quarters anymore. Overseer Miller, a man who prided himself on his strength and his cruelty, woke up with a tremor in his right hand. He tried to grip his whip, but his fingers wouldn't obey. He looked down and saw his nail fells turning a dark, muddy blue. He thought it was the dampness of the Maryland morning, but the heat in his palm told a different story. He walked into the kitchen, his face pale, demanding to know what Silas had put in the porridge. Silas didn't look up from the oven. He just pointed to the barrel of flour the master had provided. "Same as always, boss," Silas said, his voice as flat as a stone. "Master says it's the finest rye in the county." Miller grunted, but you could see the fear in the way he kept rubbing his hand against his thigh, trying to bring the life back into it. He didn't know that the holy fire didn't care about rank or color. It only cared about who ate the bread. The atmosphere on the plantation shifted. It went from a place of labor to a place of waiting. Everyone was waiting for the next one to fall. The sound of the morning bell was replaced by the sound of coughing and the low rhythmic moaning of those whose limbs were starting to die. And yet, Master Sterling continued to sit at his long mahogany table, eating his toast and drinking his wine, pretending that everything was fine. He thought he was a god, capable of deciding who lived and who rotted. He didn't realize that his baker was the one truly in control of the house. Silas began to swap the sacks. It was a slow process, a handful at a time. He took the clean flour from the master's private supply and mixed it with the toxic rye meant for the quarters. And he took the most heavily infested ergot, the largest, darkest purple spurs, and saved them specifically for the loaves that went into the big house. One afternoon, a heavy flour sack burst in the middle of the silent kitchen. The sound was like a gunshot. Silas stood over the white and purple powder, looking at the mess. Eliza was there, her eyes darting to the door. She knew the overseer was just outside, his hand resting on his pistol, his temper shorter than ever because of the constant pain in his legs. Silas didn't move to clean it up. He just stared at the purple grains scattered across the floor, like tiny lethal jewels. "He thinks he's saving himself," Silas whispered, mostly to himself, "but he's just building his own pyre." At that moment, the door swung open. Miller stood there, leaning heavily against the frame. His face was a mask of sweat and agony. "What's that smell?" Miller barked, his voice cracking. "Why does this kitchen smell like a damn swamp?" Silas looked him right in the eye, something he would never have dared to do a week ago. "It's the grain, boss. It's just the grain." Miller took a step forward, his boots dragging on the floor, and for a second it looked like he was going to strike Silas, but then his leg gave out. He collapsed onto the floor, his hand clawing at the spilled flour, and as he lay there gasping, he looked at his own hand. The skin was peeling away in long gray strips. The fire had finally caught up with him. The investigation was no longer a secret. The plague had breached the walls of the big house, and the master's wife had taken to her bed with a fever that no amount of cold water could cure. Silas watched from the shadows of the pantry as the master paced the hallway, his own gait becoming heavy and uneven. The man was starting to limp. The very poison he had brought to hide his ruin was now flowing through his own veins, and he was too arrogant to even realize it. He thought he was sick with worry. He didn't know he was eating his own bankruptcy every morning. Silas reached into his pocket and felt the large, curved ergot fungus he had kept as a reminder. It was cold, hard, and sharp. The purple spur. It was the seed of death, and Silas was about to plant it exactly where it needed to go. But the overseer was still watching, and the master's desk was still locked. The bill of sale, the only thing that could prove this wasn't an act of God, was still out of reach. And as the sun began to set over the dying plant, his work and looked up, his expression as blank as an unwritten page, only the water from the well, master, the same as I give to everyone. Sterling took a step forward, stumbling slightly, as his left foot refused to lift properly. He grabbed Silas by the collar, pulling the baker's face close to his own. Silas could smell the wine and the decay on the man's breath. "You're a liar," Sterling spat. "You've been practicing that root work. You've brought a curse on this house because you're ungrateful. I've fed you, I've kept you, and this is how you pay me?" Reparano aphasia duum. He was the one who had signed the bill of sale for the toxic grain. He was the one who had watched his workers lose limbs and done nothing. But in his mind, he was still the victim. Silas didn't flinch. He didn't pull away. He looked directly into the master's bloodshot eyes and said, "I only bake what you give me, master. The flour comes from your barn. The water comes from your earth. If there's a curse, it didn't come from my hands. It came from the sack." Sterling's grip tightened for a second, his knuckles white, but then a wave of dizziness hit him. He let go of Silas and slumped against the table, his hand landing right in a pile of raw, purple-flecked flour. He stared at it for a moment, his pupils dilated, but his mind refused to make the connection. He was too deep in his own lie to see the truth sitting right under his palm. "Get out," Sterling whispered. "Get out before I have Miller string you up." Silas didn't argue. He wiped his hands on his apron and walked out the back door, leaving the master alone in the kitchen with the bread that was killing him. But Silas wasn't going to the quarters. He had a meeting to keep. Eliza was waiting for him near the smokehouse, her face pale and her eyes wide with terror. She had spent the night listening to the screams from the big house, and she knew the clock was ticking. "He's looking for the bill of sale," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. "He was in the study this morning, tearing through the drawers. He knows if anyone finds that paper, he's finished. Not just bankrupt, Silas. They'll hang him for what he did to the workers." This was the new obstacle. If Sterling burned that bill of sale, the proof would be gone forever. All Silas would have was a story, and a slave story wouldn't hold up in a court of law against a white man's reputation. They needed that paper, but the study was locked, and the master was patrolling the house like a wounded wolf. The only way in was through the small window in the back, but it was too high for Silas and too narrow for anyone but a child. And then there was the doctor. Word had reached the plantation that Dr. Eris Thorne was on his way. Thorne wasn't like the local barbers who called themselves doctors. He was a man of science from the city, a man who didn't believe in curses or witchcraft. If he saw the symptoms, he would look for a physical cause. He would look at the water, the air, and eventually the food. The arrival of the doctor was a double-edged sword. On one hand, he could confirm the poisoning. On the other, if Sterling managed to hide the grain and destroy the bill of sale before Thorne arrived, the doctor might conclude it was a natural plague, and the blame would fall squarely on Silas. The master would tell the doctor that Silas had poisoned the well or cursed the kitchen, and the law would take care of the rest. Silas looked at his daughter. He saw the way she was shaking, the way she kept looking at her own feet, terrified that the fire would start in her, too. He realized then that he wasn't just fighting for justice anymore. He was fighting for their lives. If the master survived this, he would kill them both to cover his tracks. "Where did he put the key, Eliza?" Silas asked. his voice low and steady. Eliza swallowed hard. He keeps it in his vest pocket. He doesn't take it off, not even to sleep. But Silas, there's something else. A man came to the gate this morning, a merchant named Henderson. He was shouting about money. He said the master owed him for the special rye, and if he didn't get paid by tomorrow, he was going to the sheriff. This was the piece of the puzzle Silas hadn't expected. The merchant wasn't just a supplier. He was a witness. He knew exactly what he had sold to Sterling. But a man like Henderson wouldn't talk for free. He was likely just as dirty as the master, looking to squeeze more money out of a dying man. The situation was spiraling out of control. You have a master losing his mind to hallucinations and ergotism, an overseer who can't walk, a doctor on the way who might be a savior or a hangman, and a merchant who knows the truth but wants a bribe. And in the middle of it all, a baker who is still feeding the fire. Silas felt the weight of the purple spur in his pocket. It felt like it was glowing, like it was pulsing with its own dark energy. He knew he had to act tonight. If he didn't get that bill of sale before the doctor arrived, everything would be lost. Later that afternoon, the carriage pulled up the long, dusty driveway. Dr. Eris Thorne stepped out carrying a heavy black leather bag. He was a tall man with a sharp nose and eyes that seemed to see through everything they landed on. He didn't look at the grand architecture of the big house with admiration. He looked at the sagging porch and the unpainted shutters with a clinical detachment. He walked into the house, and within minutes the sound of his voice echoed through the halls. He wasn't whispering. He was asking questions. When did the tremors start? What has the patient been eating? Show me the water supply. Master Sterling tried to lead him away from the kitchen, tried to talk about bad air and slave superstitions, but the doctor wasn't listening. He went straight to Margaret's room. Silas stood in the hallway, hidden by the shadows of a large grandfather clock, and watched. He saw the doctor pull back the sheets. He saw the man's face harden when he saw the blackened, peeling skin on Margaret's legs. Thorne didn't look scared. He looked angry. He knew what this was. He had seen it in the poor districts of the city, where unscrupulous bakers mixed sawdust and rotted grain into their bread. He turned to Sterling, his voice cold and precise. This isn't a plague, Sterling, and it certainly isn't a curse. This is a poisoning. Sterling's face went from pale to a ghostly white. Poisoning? You mean the servants? I knew it. I knew that baker was no good. He was already leaning into the lie, already trying to point the finger at Silas, but the doctor wasn't convinced. Poisoning is rarely the work of one man in a house this size, unless he has a motive, and usually the motive is found in the pantry. Show me your grain stores. Silas felt his heart hammer against his ribs. This was the moment. If the doctor found the ergot in the barn, the master would claim he didn't know it was there. He would say Silas had cheated him. He would say Silas must have been the one who knew. But what the master didn't know was that Silas had moved the evidence. He hadn't hidden it. He had put it exactly where it would be most visible. He had taken the most infested sacks, the ones with the merchant seal still on them, and moved them to the small pantry directly behind the kitchen, the one the master hadn't visited in weeks. And he had left something else there, too, a tin that contained the blackened, rotted samples of the bread he had been serving to the quarters. Just as the doctor started towards the kitchen, the front door burst open. It was Henderson, the merchant. He didn't care about the sick woman or the doctor. He was a man who saw his investment disappearing, and he wanted his cut. "Sterling," he bellowed, "don't you hide from me. I want my money for that rye, or I'm taking your horses and your help to settle the debt." The room went silent. The doctor stopped in his tracks and turned to look at the merchant, then at the master. The air in the hallway felt thick, like it was filled with smoke and the trap was closing. Master Sterling looked like a man standing on the edge of a cliff, and the wind was starting to blow. The problem was Sterling still had the key. He still had the bill of sale in his pocket, and as he looked at the doctor and then at the merchant, a desperate, murderous clarity came over his face. He realized that if he couldn't hide the truth, he would have to destroy the witnesses. He reached into his coat, not for the key, but for the small, silver-plated pistol he kept for emergencies. Silas saw the movement from the shadows. He saw Eliza's eyes widen as she stood behind the doctor. The fire was no longer just in their limbs, it was about to consume the entire house. And as the master raised the gun, Silas realized that the time for baking was over. It was time for the harvest. The silver-plated pistol didn't stop the master's hand from shaking. He thought he was pointing it at a threat, but the real enemy was already inside his skin, eating its way to the surface. Master Sterling stood in the center of the hallway, the weapon leveled at Dr. Thorne, while Henderson, the merchant, backed away with his hands raised. The air in the house felt thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and the sharp metallic scent of the bone saw in the doctor's bag. Sterling's eyes were red-shot, and he kept blinking as if trying to clear away a swarm of flies that only he could see. This is what the ergotum does when it hits the brain. It doesn't just kill the flesh, it twists the mind into a knot of paranoia and visions. Sterling wasn't just seeing a doctor and a merchant, he was seeing ghosts. He was seeing the blackened faces of the men he had buried in shallow graves behind the barn. "You're all in it together," Sterling rasped. His voice sounded like dry husks rubbing against each other. "You want the land. You want the girl. You want to see me crawl." Dr. Thorne didn't move. He stood with a calm that only a man who has looked death in the face every day can possess. He looked at the master's hand, the way the fingers were clawed, the way the skin was turning the color of a bruised plum. "Master Sterling, put the gun down," the doctor said, his voice low and steady. "You are suffering from a convulsive ergotism. Every moment you stand there, the poison is cutting off the life to your brain. You need treatment, not a shootout." But Sterling wasn't listening. He felt a sudden sharp jolt of fire shoot up his arm, and his finger jerked on the trigger. The sound where everything could go wrong. If Sterling started firing blindly, Eliza would be the first to fall. Silas stepped out from the dark, not with a weapon, but with a bowl of water and a clean cloth. He walked toward the master with his head down, playing the part of the submissive servant one last time. "Master," Silas said, his voice a soothing hum, "the fire is high. Let me cool your hands. Let me help you sit." In reality, Silas was walking toward a loaded gun held by a madman, but he didn't stumble. He knew the master's mind was slipping. Sterling looked at Silas, and for a second, the madness cleared. He saw his baker, the man who had fed him every morning for 20 years. He saw a lifeline. "Silas," the master whimpered, the pistol sagging in his hand. "Make it stop. The burning. Make it stop." As Silas reached out to take the gun, a heavy thud echoed from the front porch. The door swung open, and Overseer Miller crawled into the house. He couldn't walk anymore. He was dragging his lower body across the floorboards, his face smeared with dirt and tears. "Master," Miller cried out, "my legs, they're gone. They've turned black." The sight of the overseer, the man who was supposed to be the plantation's strength, reduced to a crawling wreck, was the final blow to Sterling's sanity. He screamed, a high-pitched animal sound, and backed away from Silas. He tripped over his own stiffening leg and fell hard against the hallway wall. The pistol clattered across the floor, sliding right toward the doctor's feet. But something else fell out of the master's coat pocket, too. A small brass key and a folded piece of parchment stained with sweat and grease, the bill of sale. It lay there on the floorboards, a silent confession of a mass murder committed for the sake of a few hundred. Henderson, the merchant, saw the paper and his eyes narrowed. He knew what it was. He made a move to grab it, but the doctor was faster. The doctor stepped on the paper, his leather boot pinning it to the floor. "I think this belongs to the law," Thorne said, looking directly at the merchant. Henderson froze. He realized that if that paper was read, he would be implicated as the supplier of the poison. He looked at the doctor, then at the dying master, and then at the back door. He knew the game was up. Without a word, the merchant turned and ran, his boots thundering on the porch as he fled toward his horse. He didn't care about the money anymore. He only cared about the gallows. But the danger wasn't over. Master Sterling, fueled by a final desperate burst of neurological energy, lunged for the doctor's throat. He was hallucinating that Thorn was a demon sent to drag him into the pit. Silas moved. He didn't use his fists, he used his weight. He tackled the master, pinning the man's wasting body to the floor. "Eliza, get the paper," Silas shouted. Eliza didn't hesitate. She darted out from behind the cupboard, snatched the bill of sale from under the doctor's foot, and backed away. She held the proof in her hands, her fingers trembling so hard the paper rattled. Master Sterling was foaming at the mouth now, his limbs twitching in the rhythmic, violent contractions of the St. Anthony's fire. The poison had finally reached his central nervous system. He wasn't just feeling the heat, his body was trying to tear itself apart. Dr. Thorne knelt beside them, opening his bag and pulling out a bottle of laudanum. "Hold him down, Silas," the doctor ordered. "I need to sedate him before he breaks his own spine." Silas held on, feeling the brittle bones of the man who had oppressed him for decades. There was no joy in it, only a grim, cold satisfaction. The master was finally as helpless as the men he had poisoned. As the laudanum took effect and Sterling's body went limp, the house fell into an eerie silence, broken only by the distant, pathetic sobbing of Overseer Miller on the porch. The doctor stood up, wiping his hands on a handkerchief. He looked at Silas, then at Eliza, and finally at the paper in her hand. "Give it to me, girl," Thorne said. His voice wasn't a command, it was a request. Eliza looked at her father. Silas nodded slowly. He knew Thorne was a man of his word, but he also knew that in this world, a paper in a black hand was a target, while a paper in a white hand was evidence. The doctor took the bill of sale and walked to the window, letting the dying afternoon light hit the ink. He read it in silence. His face, which had been a mask of professional detachment, began to change. His jaw tightened, his eyes darkened with a fury that Silas had never seen in a man of his class. "Great sea," the doctor whispered, "not for human consumption. Signed, Sterling." He looked at the master, who was now snoring in a drug-induced stupor on the floor. He knew the whole time. Thorne turned to Silas. "How long has he been feeding this to the people in the quarters?" "Since the first frost, doctor," Silas said, his voice low and steady. 3 are dead, 10 more can't walk. Caleb, he's losing his sight." The doctor looked down at his bone saw, then back at the master. "The law in this county is slow, and it's often blind when the victim is poor and the criminal is a landowner. But I have friends in the city, men who don't like to see the medical profession used as a cover for murder." He folded the paper and tucked it deep into his own waistcoat. "This plantation is finished. The bank will take the land, and the sheriff will take the man. But that doesn't help the people in the quarters. They need medicine. They need real food." Unbeknownst to Silas, he hadn't just swapped the grain to poison the master. He had been skimming the clean flour for weeks, hiding it in small jars buried beneath the floorboards of the kitchen. He had enough to keep the workers fed for a month, but he couldn't reveal it without admitting he had been stealing. He looked at the doctor, weighing the risk. "There is good flour, doctor," Silas said. "Hidden. I took it to keep my daughter alive. If you tell the sheriff, I'll hang. But if you don't, the people can eat tonight." Dr. Thorne looked at Silas, really looked at him for the first time. He saw the intelligence in the baker's eyes, the calculated risk he had taken, and the weight of the lives he had tried to save. The doctor glanced at the unconscious master, then at the overseer who was still groveling on the porch. "I didn't see any hidden flour, Silas," the doctor said quietly. "I only saw a man doing what he had to do to survive a monster." He turned back to his bag. "Now help me get this man onto the table. His leg is beyond saving. I have to take it before the rot spreads to his heart." Silas helped the doctor lift the master. He felt the weight of the man's leg, heavy, cold, and smelling of death. As they laid him out on the long kitchen table, the very table where Silas had spent his life kneading bread, the baker felt a strange sense of completion. The table that had seen the master's luxury would now see his mutilation. The purple spur in Silas's pocket felt lighter now. The secret was out. The fire was burning the right person. But as the doctor reached for the bone saw, A shadow fell across the doorway. It was the sheriff's deputy, alerted by the sound of the gunshot. He stood there with his hand on his belt, looking at the bloody scene in the kitchen. "What in the hell is going on here?" the deputy demanded. The doctor didn't even look up. "I'm performing a life-saving amputation on a man who has committed a capital crime," Thorne said. "And if you want to be more than a footnote in this tragedy, you'll go find the merchant Henderson before he crosses the county line." The deputy hesitated, looking at Silas with suspicion. He saw a slave standing over a white man with a bloodied cloth. He saw the master's leg blackened and horrifying. He saw a house in total collapse. The question was, would the deputy follow the doctor's lead, or would he see Silas as the easiest target for his anger? The tension in the room was a physical thing, a wire pulled so tight it was humming, and in that moment, Silas realized that the truth wasn't just about the grain, it was about who survived to tell the story. The sound of the bone saw hitting Master Sterling's femur was a dry, raspy noise that seemed to vibrate through the very floorboards of the kitchen. It was the sound of a debt finally being collected. The deputy stood by the door, his face turning a shade of green that matched the rot on the master's legs, but he didn't move to stop the doctor. Dr. Thorne worked with a cold, surgical fury, his sleeves rolled up and his apron splattered with the dark, thick blood of a man whose body was already half dead. Silas held the master's shoulders, feeling the tremors rack the man's frame as the drug began to wear off just enough for the pain to pierce through. This was the moment of reckoning. The kitchen, usually a place of heat and the sweet smell of rising yeast, now smelled like a butcher shop in the middle of a swamp. Master Sterling's eyes snapped open. The pupils were pinpricks of black in a sea of bloodshot white. He looked down, saw the doctor's saw, and then looked up at Silas. For a second, the madness of the ergot was gone, replaced by a raw, naked terror. He realized he was on his own kitchen table. He realized his power had evaporated the moment his blood turned to poison. He tried to speak, but his throat was too dry, his tongue swollen from the same rot eating his limbs. He reached out a clawed hand to grab Silas's shirt, a silent plea for mercy from the man he had spent 20 years treating like a beast of burden. Silas didn't flinch. He didn't look away. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the purple spur, that large, curved piece of toxic fungus he had carried like a talisman. He dropped it directly onto the table, right next to the master's cheek, so the man had to look at it. "You paid for this rot, master," Silas said, his voice a low, terrifying rumble that drowned out the sound of the saw. "It is only right that you are the one to finish it." Sterling's eyes bulged as he recognized the black grain. He saw the proof of his own greed lying inches from his nose. He realized then that Silas knew. Silas had known from the very first sack. The master's mouth opened in a silent scream as the doctor made the final cut. The weight of the leg dropped into a wooden bucket with a dull thud, and with it the era of the Sterling plantation officially came to an end. The man who owned the land was now just a fragment of a person, bleeding out on a table where his bread was once made. The deputy finally found his voice, but it was weak. I have to take him in. If he survives, he's going to the county jail." Dr. Thorne didn't even look up as he began to cauterize the stump. "He won't be going anywhere for a long time, deputy. And if you're smart, you'll take that bill of sale I gave you and find the merchant who sold him this death. Because if you don't, I'll make sure the governor hears how this county protects men who poison their own workers to save $1. The deputy nodded quickly, eager to get away from the smell and the cold, judging eyes of the baker. He backed out of the kitchen, stumbling over Overseer Miller, who was still moaning on the porch, his own legs turning into pillars of black stone. The night that followed was one of frantic, hushed activity. While the master lay in a stupor in the big house, Silas and Eliza moved with a purpose they had never known before. The doctor had given them a choice. He couldn't give them their legal freedom, not yet, but he could give them a head start. He had written a letter of passage claiming they were his medical assistants tasked with transporting samples to a clinic in the north. It was a thin lie, but with the chaos of the plantation's collapse, it was enough. The overseer was crippled, a master was mutilated, and the mistress was drifting toward death. There was no one left to give orders. Silas went back to the barn one last time. He didn't go for the grain, he went for the hidden jars of clean flour he had buried under the floorboards. He distributed them among the families in the quarters, whispering the truth to them as he went. He told them about the bill of sale. He told them the fire wasn't a curse from God, but a crime committed by a man. He saw the light of understanding in their eyes, a flame that was much more dangerous to the system of slavery than any fungus could ever be. They weren't just sick anymore, they were witnesses, and a witness with nothing left to lose is a man the world should fear. By the time the sun began to peek over the Maryland horizon, Silas and Eliza were standing at the edge of the woods, their few belongings tied in small bundles. They looked back at the big house. From this distance it looked majestic, but Silas knew it was a hollow shell filled with the stench of gangrene and the echoes of screams. The plantation was a graveyard of dreams and a monument to a greed that had finally consumed itself. Silas felt the weight of the years lifting from his shoulders, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. He wasn't a baker anymore. He wasn't a slave. He was a survivor who had turned the master's own weapon against him. Master Sterling. He survived the amputation, but the rot had already touched his mind. He spent the rest of his short life in a debtor's prison, his mind trapped in a permanent hallucination of fire and purple grain. He died alone, screaming that his bed was made of hot coals. The plantation was seized by the bank, but no one would buy it. Rumors spread that the ground itself was poisoned, that the holy fire still lived in the soil. The big house eventually burned down, some say by accident, some say by the hands of those who had suffered within its walls. The merchant, Henderson, was caught 3 counties away and was hanged not for the poisoning, but for the debts he owed to men more powerful than himself. In the end, the ledger always balances. Silas and Eliza made it to Philadelphia. It wasn't an easy journey, and the cold of the North was a different kind of fire, but they were free. Silas found work in a small bakery, but he never touched rye again. He spent the rest of his days working with white wheat, making bread that was pure and clean. He never spoke of the plantation, but sometimes in the middle of the night he would wake up and feel his own hands. He would remember the rhythm of the kneading and the feel of the purple spur under his palm. He knew that he had committed a dark act, but he also knew that a man who sows poison should not be surprised when it grows in his own garden. The truth didn't just end the pain, it broke the chains that no hammer could ever touch. The logic of error is simple. Greed leaves a trail that even fire cannot burn away. Master Sterling thought he could treat human lives like numbers on a balance sheet, but he forgot that a man's survival instinct is stronger than any debt. He forgot that the people he thought he owned were the ones who provided his very life. When you poison the well, you eventually have to drink from it yourself, and when that day comes, there is no amount of money or status that can save you from the harvest you've planted. Justice isn't always a gavel in a courtroom. Sometimes it's a bone saw on a kitchen table. Sometimes it's a secret bill of sale found in the dirt. And sometimes it's a baker who knows that the most powerful ingredient in any loaf of bread is the truth. Silas died an old man, surrounded by grandchildren who never knew the smell of gangrene or the sound of a whip. He left them a legacy of resilience and a warning that he whispered to them whenever they sat down to eat. Respect the grain, for it knows the heart of the man who grew it. The story of the Sterling Plantation is a cold investigation into how a handful of black grain can turn a powerful man into a desperate victim of his own cruelty. It serves as a reminder that the scales of history are always moving, even when they seem stuck. If you look closely at the old records, you can still find the mention of a mysterious plague in Maryland in the mid-1800s. But now you know the truth. It wasn't a plague, it was a reckoning. It was the moment the fire finally jumped from the quarters to the big house, and in the ashes, a few people found the strength to walk away. If this story touched you, leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more accounts of justice and hidden history. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that the truth always finds a way out. And don't forget to comment. Let us know which city or state you're watching from. Your support helps us keep these stories alive. Until next time, remember a man's life always balances in the end, whether he likes the total or